Joseph Stalin. The Foundations of Leninism. 3. Theory. From this theme I take 3 questions. A. The importance of theory for the proletarian movement. B. Criticism of the theory of spontaneity. C. The theory of the proletarian revolution. 1. The importance of theory. Some think that Leninism is the precedence of practice over theory in the sense that its main point is the translation of the Marxist theses into deeds, their execution. As for theory, it is alleged that Leninism is rather unconcerned about it. We know that Plekhanov time and again chaffed Lenin about his unconcern for theory, and particularly for philosophy. We also know that theory is not held in great favor by many present-day Leninist practical workers, particularly in view of the immense amount of practical work imposed upon them by the situation. I must declare that this more than odd opinion about Lenin and Leninism is quite wrong and bears no relation whatever to the truth, that the attempt of practical workers to brush theory aside runs counter to the whole spirit of Leninism and is fraught with serious dangers to the work. Theory is the experience of the working class movement in all countries taken in its general aspect. Of course, theory becomes purposeless if it is not connected with revolutionary practice, just as practice gropes in the dark if its path is not illumined by revolutionary theory. But theory can become a tremendous force in the working class movement if it is built up in indissoluble connection with revolutionary practice, for theory, and theory alone, can give the movement confidence, the power of orientation, and an understanding of the inner relation of surrounding events, for it, and it alone, can help practice to realize not only how and in which direction classes are moving at the present time, but also how and in which direction they will move in the near future. None other than Lenin uttered and repeated scores of times the well-known thesis that without a revolutionary theory there can be no revolutionary movement. See footnote 1, see volume 4, page 380. Lenin, better than anyone else, understood the great importance of theory, particularly for a party such as ours, in view of the vanguard fighter of the international proletariat which has fallen to its lot, and in view of the complicated internal and international situation in which it finds itself. Foreseeing this special role of our party as far back as 1902, he thought it necessary even then to point out that the role of vanguard fighter can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by the most advanced theory. See volume 4, page 380. It scarcely needs proof that now, when Lenin's prediction about the role of our party has come true, this thesis of Lenin's acquires special force and special importance. Perhaps the most striking expression of the great importance which Lenin attached to theory is the fact that none other than Lenin undertook the very serious task of generalizing, on the basis of materialist philosophy, the most important achievements of science from the time of Engels down to his time, as well as of subjecting to comprehensive criticism the anti-materialistic trends among Marxists. Engels said that materialism must assume a new aspect with every new great discovery. See footnote 2. It is well known that none other than Lenin accomplished this task for his own time in his remarkable work Materialism and Empirio-Criticism. See footnote 3. It is well known that Plekhanov, who loved to chaff Lenin about his unconcern for philosophy, did not even dare to make a serious attempt to undertake such a task. 2. Criticism of the theory of spontaneity, or the role of the vanguard in the movement. The theory of spontaneity is a theory of opportunism, a theory of worshipping the spontaneity of the labor movement, a theory which actually repudiates the leading role of the vanguard of the working class, of the party of the working class. The theory of worshipping spontaneity is decidedly opposed to the revolutionary character of the working class movement. It is opposed to the movement taking the line of struggle against the foundations of capitalism. It is in favor of the movement proceeding exclusively along the line of realizable demands, of demands acceptable to capitalism. It is wholly in favor of the line of least resistance. The theory of spontaneity is the ideology of trade unionism. The theory of worshipping spontaneity is decidedly opposed to giving the spontaneous movement a politically conscious, planned character. It is opposed to the party marching at the head of the working class, to the party raising the masses to the level of political consciousness, to the party leading the movement. It is in favor of the politically conscious elements of the movement not hindering the movement from taking its own course. It is in favor of the party only heeding the spontaneous movement and dragging at the tail of it. The theory of spontaneity is the theory of belittling the role of the conscious element in the movement, the ideology of Kvostism, the logical basis of all opportunism. In practice, this theory, which appeared on the scene even before the first revolution in Russia, led its adherents, the so-called economists, to deny the need for an independent workers' party in Russia, to oppose the revolutionary struggle of the working class for the overthrow of Tsarism, to preach a purely trade unionist policy in the movement, and, in general, to surrender the labor movement to the hegemony of the liberal bourgeoisie. The fight of the old Iskra and the brilliant criticism of the theory of Kvostism in Lenin's pamphlet What is to be Done? Not only smashed so-called economism, but also created the theoretical foundations for a truly revolutionary movement of the Russian working class. Without this fight it would have been quite useless even to think of creating an independent workers' party in Russia and of its playing a leading part in the revolution. But the theory of worshipping spontaneity is not an exclusively Russian phenomenon. It is extremely widespread in a somewhat different form. It is true in all parties of the Second International, without exception. I have in mind the so-called productive forces theory as debased by the leaders of the Second International, which justifies everything and conciliates everybody, which records facts and explains them after everyone has become sick and tired of them, and, having recorded them, rests content. Marx said that the materialist theory could not confine itself to explaining the world, that it must also change it. See footnote 4, but Kautsky and company are not concerned with this, they prefer to rest content with the first part of Marx's formula. Here is one of the numerous examples of the application of this theory. It is said that before the imperialist war the parties of the Second International threatened to declare war against war if the imperialists should start a war. It is said that on the very eve of the war these parties pigeonholed the war against war slogan and applied an opposite one, viz., war for the imperialist fatherland. It is said that as a result of this change of slogans millions of workers were sent to their death. But it would be a mistake to think that there were some people to blame for this, that someone was unfaithful to the working class or betrayed it. Not at all. Everything happened as it should have happened. Firstly, because the International, it seems, is an instrument of peace, and not of war. Secondly, because, in view of the level of the productive forces which then prevailed, nothing else could be done. The productive forces are to blame. That is the precise explanation vouchsafed to us by Mr. Kautsky's theory of the productive forces. And whoever does not believe in that theory is not a Marxist. The role of the parties? Their importance for the movement? But what can a party do against so decisive a factor as the level of the productive forces? One could cite a host of similar examples of the falsification of Marxism. It scarcely needs proof that this spurious Marxism, designed to hide the nakedness of opportunism, is merely a European variety of the selfsame theory of Kvostism which Lenin fought even before the first Russian Revolution. It scarcely needs proof that the demolition of this theoretical falsification is a preliminary condition for the creation of truly revolutionary parties in the West. 3. The theory of the Proletarian Revolution. Lenin's theory of the Proletarian Revolution proceeds from three fundamental theses. First thesis, the domination of finance capital in the advanced capitalist countries, the issue of stocks and bonds as one of the principal operations of finance capital, the export of capital to the sources of raw materials, which is one of the foundations of imperialism, the omnipotence of a financial oligarchy, which is the result of the domination of finance capital. All this reveals the grossly parasitic character of monopolistic capitalism, makes the yoke of the capitalist trusts and syndicates 100 times more burdensome, intensifies the indignation of the working class with the foundations of capitalism, and brings the masses to the proletarian revolution as their only salvation. See Lenin, Imperialism, see footnote 5. Hence the first conclusion, intensification of the revolutionary crisis within the capitalist countries and growth of the elements of an explosion on the internal, proletarian front in the metropolises. Second thesis, the increase in the export of capital to the colonies and dependent countries, the expansion of spheres of influence and colonial possessions until they cover the whole globe, the transformation of capitalism into a world system of financial enslavement and colonial oppression of the vast majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. All this has, on the one hand, converted the separate national economies and national territories into links in a single chain called world economy, and, on the other hand, split the population of the globe into two camps. A handful of advanced capitalist countries which exploit and oppress vast colonies and dependencies, and the huge majority consisting of colonial independent countries which are compelled to wage a struggle for liberation from the imperialist yoke. See imperialism. Hence the second conclusion, intensification of the revolutionary crisis in the colonial countries and growth of the elements of revolt against imperialism on the external, colonial front. Third thesis, the monopolistic possession of spheres of influence in colonies, the uneven development of the capitalist countries, leading to a frenzied struggle for the redivision of the world between the countries which have already seized territories and those claiming their share. Imperialist wars as the only means of restoring the disturbed equilibrium. All this leads to the intensification of the struggle on the third front, the intercapitalist front, which weakens imperialism and facilitates the union of the first two fronts against imperialism, the front of the revolutionary proletariat and the front of colonial emancipation. See imperialism. Hence the third conclusion, that under imperialism wars cannot be averted, and that a coalition between the proletarian revolution in Europe and the colonial revolution in the East in a united world front of revolution against the world front of imperialism is inevitable. Lenin combines all these conclusions into one general conclusion that imperialism is the eve of the socialist revolution. See footnote 6, see volume 19, page 71. The very approach to the question of the proletarian revolution, of the character of the revolution, of its scope, of its depth, the scheme of the revolution in general, changes accordingly. Formerly, the analysis of the prerequisites for the proletarian revolution was usually approached from the point of view of the economic state of individual countries. Now, this approach is no longer adequate. Now the matter must be approached from the point of view of the economic state of all or the majority of countries, from the point of view of the state of world economy, for individual countries and individual national economies have ceased to be self-sufficient units, have become links in a single chain called world economy, for the old cultured capitalism has evolved into imperialism, and imperialism is a world system of financial enslavement and colonial oppression of the vast majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. Formerly it was the accepted thing to speak of the existence or absence of objective conditions for the proletarian revolution in individual countries, or, to be more precise, in one or another developed country. Now this point of view is no longer adequate. Now we must speak of the existence of objective conditions for the revolution in the entire system of world imperialist economy as an integral whole, the existence within this system of some countries that are not sufficiently developed industrially cannot serve as an insuperable obstacle to the revolution, if the system as a whole or, more correctly, because the system as a whole is already ripe for revolution. Formerly, it was the accepted thing to speak of the proletarian revolution in one or another developed country as of a separate and self-sufficient entity opposing a separate national front of capital as its antipode. Now, this point of view is no longer adequate. Now we must speak of the world proletarian revolution, for the separate national fronts of capital have become links in a single chain called the world front of imperialism, which must be opposed by a common front of the revolutionary movement in all countries. Formerly the proletarian revolution was regarded exclusively as the result of the internal development of a given country. Now, this point of view is no longer adequate. Now the proletarian revolution must be regarded primarily as the result of the development of the contradictions within the world system of imperialism, as the result of the breaking of the chain of the world imperialist front in one country or another. Where will the revolution begin? Where, in what country, can the front of capital be pierced first? Where industry is more developed, where the proletarian constitutes the majority, where the proletariat constitutes the majority, where there is more culture, where there is more democracy. That was the reply usually given formerly. No, objects the Leninist theory of revolution, not necessarily where industry is more developed, and so forth. The front of capital will be pierced where the chain of imperialism is weakest, for the proletarian revolution is the result of the breaking of the chain of the world imperialist front at its weakest link, and it may turn out that the country which has started the revolution, which has made a breach in the front of capital, is less developed in a capitalist sense than other, more developed, countries, which have, however, remained within the framework of capitalism. In 1917 the chain of the imperialist world front proved to be weaker in Russia than in the other countries. It was there that the chain broke and provided an outlet for the proletarian revolution. Why? Because in Russia a great popular revolution was unfolding and at its head marched the revolutionary proletariat, which had such an important ally as the vast mass of the peasantry, which was oppressed and exploited by the landlords. Because the revolution there was opposed by such a hideous representative of imperialism as Tsarism, which lacked all moral prestige and was deservedly hated by the whole population. The chain proved to be weaker in Russia, although Russia was less developed in a capitalist sense than, say, France or Germany, Britain or America. Where will the chain break in the near future? Again, where it is weakest. It is not precluded that the chain may break, say, in India. Why? Because that country has a young, militant, revolutionary proletariat, which has such an ally as the National Liberation Movement, an undoubtedly powerful and undoubtedly important ally. Because there the revolution is confronted by such a well-known foe as foreign imperialism, which has no moral credit and is deservedly hated by all the oppressed and exploited masses in India. It is also quite possible that the chain will break in Germany. Why? Because the factors which are operating, say, in India are beginning to operate in Germany as well, but, of course, the enormous difference in the level of development between India and Germany cannot but stamp its imprint on the progress and outcome of a revolution in Germany. Lenin said that the West European capitalist countries will consummate their development toward socialism, not by the even maturing of socialism in them, but by the exploitation of some countries by others, by the exploitation of the first of the countries to be vanquished in the imperialist war combined with the exploitation of the whole of the East. On the other hand, precisely as a result of the first imperialist war, the East has definitely come into revolutionary movement, has been definitely drawn into the general maelstrom of the world revolutionary movement. See Volume 27, pages 415-16. Briefly, the chain of the imperialist front must, as a rule, break where the links are weaker and, at all events, not necessarily where capitalism is more developed, where there is such and such a percentage of proletarians and such a percentage of peasants, and so on. That is why in deciding the question of proletarian revolution, statistical estimates of the percentage of the proletarian population in a given country lose the exceptional importance so eagerly attached to them by the doctrinaires of the Second International, who have not understood imperialism and who fear revolution like the plague. To proceed. The heroes of the Second International asserted, and continue to assert, that between the bourgeois democratic revolution and the proletarian revolution there is a chasm, or at any rate a Chinese wall, separating one from the other by a more or less protracted interval of time, during which the bourgeoisie, having come into power, develops capitalism, while the proletariat accumulates strength and prepares for the decisive struggle against capitalism. This interval is usually calculated to extend over many decades, if not longer. It scarcely needs proof that this Chinese wall theory is totally devoid of scientific meaning under the conditions of imperialism, that it is and can be only a means of concealing and camouflaging the counter-revolutionary aspirations of the bourgeoisie. It scarcely needs proof that under the conditions of imperialism, fraught as it is with collisions and wars, under the conditions of the eve of the socialist revolution, When flourishing capitalism becomes moribund capitalism, Lenin, and the revolutionary movement is growing in all countries of the world, when imperialism is allying itself with all reactionary forces without exception, down to and including Tsarism and serfdom, thus making imperative the coalition of all revolutionary forces, from the proletarian movement of the West, to the national liberation movement of the East, when the overthrow of the survivals of the regime of feudal serfdom becomes impossible without a revolutionary struggle against imperialism, it scarcely needs proof that the bourgeois democratic revolution, in a more or less developed country, must under such circumstances verge upon the proletarian revolution, that the former must pass into the latter. The history of the revolution in Russia has provided palpable proof that this thesis is correct and incontrovertible. It was not without reason that Lenin, as far back as 1905, on the eve of the First Russian Revolution, in his pamphlet Two Tactics depicted the bourgeois democratic revolution and the socialist revolution as two links in the same chain, as a single and integral picture of the sweep of the Russian Revolution. The proletariat must carry to completion the democratic revolution, by allying to itself the mass of the peasantry in order to crush by force the resistance of the autocracy and to paralyze the instability of the bourgeoisie. The proletariat must accomplish the socialist revolution, by allying to itself the mass of the semi-proletarian elements of the population in order to crush by force the resistance of the bourgeoisie and to paralyze the instability of the peasantry and the petty bourgeoisie. Such are the tasks of the proletariat, which the newscrists present so narrowly in all their arguments and resolutions about the sweep of the revolution. See Lenin, Volume 8, page 96. There is no need to mention other, later works of Lenin's, in which the idea of the bourgeoisie revolution passing into the proletarian revolution stands out in greater relief than in Two Tactics as one of the cornerstones of the Leninist theory of revolution. Some comrades believe, it seems, that Lenin arrived at this idea only in 1916, that up to the time he had thought that the revolution in Russia would remain within the bourgeois framework, that power, consequently, would pass from the hands of the organ of the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry into the hands of the bourgeoisie and not of the proletariat. It is said that this assertion has even penetrated into our communist press. I must say that this assertion is absolutely wrong, that it is totally at variance with the facts. I might refer to Lenin's well-known speech at the Third Congress of the Party, 1905, in which he defined the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, that is, the victory of the democratic revolution, not as the organization of order but as the organization of war, see Volume 7, page 264. Further, I might refer to Lenin's well-known articles on the Provisional Government, 1905, see footnote 7, where, outlining the prospects of the unfolding Russian Revolution, he assigns to the party the task of ensuring that the Russian Revolution is not a movement of a few months, but a movement of many years, that it leads, not merely to slight concessions on the part of the powers that be, but to the complete overthrow of those powers, where, enlarging further on these prospects and linking them with the revolution in Europe, he goes on to say, and if we succeed in doing that, then the revolutionary conflagration will spread all over Europe, the European worker, languishing under bourgeois reaction, will rise in his turn and will show us how it is done, then the revolutionary wave in Europe will sweep back again into Russia and will convert an epoch of a few revolutionary years into an epoch of several revolutionary decades. Ibid, page 191. I might further refer to a well-known article by Lenin published in November 1915, in which he writes, "The proletariat is fighting, and will fight valiantly, to capture power, for a republic, for the confiscation of the land, for the participation of the non-proletarian masses of the people in liberating bourgeois Russia from military feudal imperialism, equals Tsarism. And the proletariat will immediately, see footnote 8, take advantage of this liberation of bourgeois Russia from Tsarism, from the agrarian power of the landlords, not to aid the rich peasants in their struggle against the rural worker, but to bring about the socialist revolution in alliance with the proletarians of Europe, see Volume 18, page 318. Finally, I might refer to the well-known passage in Lenin's pamphlet The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, where, referring to the above-quoted passage in Two Tactics on the Sweep of the Russian Revolution, he arrives at the following conclusion. Things turned out just as we said they would. The course taken by the revolution confirmed the correctness of our reasoning. First, with the whole of the peasantry against the monarchy, against the landlords, against the medieval regime, and to that extent the revolution remains bourgeois democratic. Then, with the poor peasants, with the semi-proletarians, with all the exploited, against capitalism, including the rural rich, the kulaks, the profiteers, and to that extent the revolution becomes a socialist one. To attempt to raise an artificial Chinese wall between the first and second, to separate them by anything else than the degree of preparedness of the proletariat and the degree of its unity with the poor peasants, means monstrously to distort Marxism, to vulgarize it, to replace it by liberalism. See Volume 23, page 391. That is sufficient, I think. Very well, we may be told, but if that is the case, why did Lenin combat the idea of permanent, uninterrupted, revolution? Because Lenin proposed that the revolutionary capacities of the peasantry be exhausted and that the fullest use be made of their revolutionary energy for the complete liquidation of Tsarism and for the transition to the proletarian revolution, whereas the adherents of permanent revolution did not understand the important role of the peasantry in the Russian Revolution, underestimated the strength of the revolutionary energy of the peasantry, underestimated the strength and ability of the Russian proletariat to lead the peasantry and thereby hampered the work of emancipating the peasantry from the influence of the bourgeois, the work of rallying the peasantry around the proletariat. Because Lenin proposed that the revolution be crowned with the transfer of power to the proletariat, whereas the adherents of permanent revolution wanted to begin at once with the establishment of the power of the proletariat, failing to realize that in so doing they were closing their eyes to such a minor detail as the survivals of serfdom and were leaving out of account so important a force as the Russian peasantry, failing to understand that such a policy could only retard the winning of the peasantry over to the side of the proletariat. Consequently, Lenin fought the adherents of permanent revolution, not over the question of uninterruptedness, for Lenin himself maintained the point of view of uninterrupted revolution, but because they underestimated the role of the peasantry, which is an enormous reserve of the proletariat, because they failed to understand the idea of the hegemony of the proletariat. The idea of permanent revolution should not be regarded as a new idea. It was first advanced by Marx at the end of the 40s in his well-known address to the Communist League, 1850. It is from this document that our permanentists took the idea of uninterrupted revolution. It should be noted that in taking it from Marx our permanentists altered it somewhat, and in altering it spoilt it and made it unfit for practical use. The experienced hand of Lenin was needed to rectify this mistake, to take Marx's idea of uninterrupted revolution in its pure form and make it a cornerstone of his theory of revolution. Here is what Marx says in his address about uninterrupted, permanent, revolution, after enumerating a number of revolutionary democratic demands which he calls upon the communists to win. While the democratic petty bourgeois wish to bring the revolution to a conclusion as quickly as possible, and with the achievement, at most, of the above demands, it is our interest and our task to make the revolution permanent, until all more or less possessing classes have been forced out of their position of dominance, until the proletariat has conquered state power, and the association of proletarians, not only in one country but in all the dominant countries of the world, has advanced so far that competition among the proletarians of these countries has ceased and that at least the decisive productive forces are concentrated in the hands of the proletarians. See footnote 9. In other words, A. Marx did not at all propose to begin the revolution in the Germany of the 50s with the immediate establishment of proletarian power contrary to the plans of our Russian permanentists. B. Marx proposed only that the revolution be crowned with the establishment of proletarian state power, by hurling, step by step, one section of the bourgeoisie after another from the heights of power, in order, after the attainment of power by the proletariat, to kindle the fire of revolution in every country, and everything that Lenin taught and carried out in the course of our revolution in pursuit of his theory of the proletarian revolution under the conditions of imperialism was fully in line with that proposition. It follows, then, that our Russian permanentists have not only underestimated the role of the peasantry in the Russian Revolution and the importance of the idea of hegemony of the proletariat, but have altered, for the worse, Marx's idea of permanent revolution and made it unfit for practical use. That is why Lenin ridiculed the theory of our permanentists, calling it original and fine, and accusing them of refusing to think why, for 10 whole years, life has passed by this fine theory. Lenin's article was written in 1915, 10 years after the appearance of the theory of the permanentists in Russia. See Volume 28, page 317. That is why Lenin regarded this theory as a semi-Menshevik theory and said that it borrows from the Bolsheviks their call for a resolute revolutionary struggle by the proletariat and the conquest of political power by the latter, and from the Mensheviks the repudiation of the role of the peasantry. See Lenin's article 2 Lines of the Revolution, Ibid. This, then, is the position in regard to Lenin's idea of the bourgeois democratic revolution passing into the proletarian revolution, of utilizing the bourgeois revolution for the immediate transition to the proletarian revolution. To proceed. Formerly, the victory of the revolution in one country was considered impossible, on the assumption that it would require the combined action of the proletarians of all or at least of a majority of the advanced countries to achieve victory over the bourgeoisie. Now this point of view no longer fits in with the facts. Now we must proceed from the possibility of such a victory, for the uneven and spasmodic character of the development of the various capitalist countries under the conditions of imperialism, the development within imperialism of catastrophic contradictions leading to inevitable wars, the growth of the revolutionary movement in all countries of the world. All this leads, not only to the possibility, but also to the necessity of the victory of the proletariat in individual countries. The history of the revolution in Russia is direct proof of this. At the same time, however, it must be borne in mind that the overthrow of the bourgeoisie can be successfully accomplished only when certain absolutely necessary conditions exist, in the absence of which there can be even no question of the proletariat taking power. Here is what Lenin says about these conditions in his pamphlet Left-Wing Communism. The fundamental law of revolution, which has been confirmed by all revolutions, and particularly by all 3 Russian revolutions in the 20th century, is as follows. It is not enough for revolution that the exploited and oppressed masses should understand the impossibility of living in the old way and demand changes. It is essential for revolution that the exploiters should not be able to live and rule in the old way. Only when the lower classes do not want the old way, and when the upper classes cannot carry on in the old way, only then can revolution triumph. This truth may be expressed in other words: revolution is impossible without a nationwide crisis, affecting both the exploited and the exploiters. See footnote 10. It follows that for revolution it is essential, first, that a majority of the workers, or at least a majority of the class-conscious, thinking, politically active workers, should fully understand that revolution is necessary and be ready to sacrifice their lives for it. Secondly, that the ruling classes should be passing through a governmental crisis, which draws even the most backward masses into politics, weakens the government and makes it possible for the revolutionaries to overthrow it rapidly. See Volume 25, page 222. But the overthrow of the power of the bourgeoisie and establishment of the power of the proletariat in one country does not yet mean that the complete victory of socialism has been ensured. After consolidating its power and leading the peasantry in its wake, the proletariat of the victorious country can and must build a socialist society. But does this mean that it will thereby achieve the complete and final victory of socialism? That is, does it mean that with the forces of only one country it can finally consolidate socialism and fully guarantee the country against intervention and, consequently, also against restoration? No, it does not. For this the victory of the revolution in at least several countries is needed. Therefore, the development and support of the revolution in other countries is an essential task of the victorious revolution. Therefore, The revolution which has been victorious in one country must regard itself not as a self-sufficient entity, but as an aid, as a means for hastening the victory of the proletariat in other countries. Lenin expressed this thought succinctly when he said that the task of the victorious revolution is to do the utmost possible in one country for the development, support and awakening of the revolution in all countries. See Volume 23, page 385. These, in general, are the characteristic features of Lenin's theory of proletarian revolution. Notes. 1. My italics, J.V. Stalin. 2. C. Friedrich Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Selected Works, Volume 2, Moscow 1951, page 338. 3. C. V. I. Lenin, Works, 4th Russian edition, Volume 14. 4. Karl Marx, Theses on Feuerbach, C. Friedrich Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, Appendix. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Selected Works, Volume 2, Moscow 1951. 5. V. I. Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, C. Works, 4th Russian edition, Volume 22, pages 173 to 290. 6. My italics, J.V. Stalin. 7. J.V. Stalin refers to the following articles written by V. I. Lenin in 1905, Social Democracy and a Provisional Revolutionary Government, from which he cites a passage. The Revolutionary Democratic Dictatorship of the Proletariat and Peasantry, and on a Provisional Revolutionary Government, see V. I. Lenin, Works, 4th Russian edition, Volume 8, pages 247 to 63, 264 to 74. 427 to 47. 8. My italics, J.V. Stalin. 9. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the first address of the Central Committee to the Communist League, see Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Selected Works, Volume 1, Moscow 1951, page 102. 10. My italics, J.V. Stalin. End of Chapter 3.